It was an ordinary day at the Allen Premium Outlets, the kind people rarely remember because nothing about it feels unusual. The parking lot was full but orderly, cars moving in and out in a steady flow, families walking toward the entrances, and groups of friends drifting between stores without any sense of urgency. The weather was clear, the atmosphere calm, and everything followed a predictable rhythm that made the environment feel safe and controlled. Inside the shopping area, that same rhythm continued. Storefront music blended with conversation, doors opened and closed in a constant pattern, and people moved with purpose but without pressure. Most were focused on small decisions: what to buy, where to go next, how long they would stay. No one was scanning for danger. No one was expecting anything to break the routine. That sense of normalcy created a quiet vulnerability. When environments feel safe, attention lowers. People rely on familiarity, not awareness, and that makes it easier for something unusual to pass unnoticed. In a crowded place, blending in requires very little effort, and that is exactly what happened. He entered the area without drawing attention, moving at the same pace as everyone else. There was nothing immediately visible that set him apart. No raised voice, no sudden movement, no behavior that demanded a second look. People passed by him without hesitation, focused on their own plans, unaware that anything was about to change. That is how moments like this begin. Not with chaos but with silence. The distance between him and the crowd closed naturally. He moved through open space, through walkways and between groups, becoming part of the environment rather than standing out from it. No one stopped. No one questioned. The setting itself allowed him to remain unnoticed. Then the first sound cut through the air. At first it did not register clearly. In a place filled with movement and noise, sharp sounds can be misinterpreted. A few people paused, turning slightly, trying to identify what they had heard, but most continued walking. The brain searched for a harmless explanation, something routine, something that fit the environment. But there was no clear explanation. When it happened again, the difference became harder to ignore. The sound was sharper, closer, and completely out of place. Conversations slowed, steps hesitated, and attention shifted without direction. People looked around, searching for context that was not there. Then it came again, and this time the meaning changed. The sound no longer blended into the environment. It stood apart, unmistakable, forcing recognition. The shift from confusion to awareness happened instantly. No one needed confirmation. The feeling alone was enough. Something was wrong. People closest to the sound reacted first. They stepped back, turned quickly, and began creating distance without waiting for anyone else. Their movement was immediate and instinctive, driven by urgency rather than understanding. Others followed. In crowded spaces, behavior spreads faster than information. One person moving quickly becomes several, then dozens, each reacting to what they see rather than what they know. Within seconds, the pattern of movement expanded across the area. The calm structure of the shopping center collapsed into uncertainty. People moved in different directions, some running toward exits, others freezing, unsure which way was safe. Voices rose, not in conversation but in urgency, short commands and fragments of information that did not fully connect. Movement became chaotic but purposeful. Shoppers who had been walking calmly seconds earlier now pushed past each other, trying to create space. Some grabbed the hands of those next to them, pulling them forward without explanation. Others lost contact immediately, separated by the speed of the movement around them. Inside stores, reactions were just as fast. Doors closed, lights dimmed, and people were guided away from open areas toward back rooms and storage spaces. The response followed a simple instinct: reduce visibility, create distance, and wait. Outside, the open layout of the outlets allowed people to move, but it also spread the reaction further. Individuals ran across walkways, between buildings and toward parking areas, each decision made with limited awareness. There was no clear direction, only the need to get away. Some ran without stopping. Others hid wherever they could. The environment that had felt open moments earlier now felt exposed. At the center of it all, the source of the disruption remained active, and that uncertainty shaped every reaction. Without clear information, every movement carried risk. People made decisions based on instinct, not certainty. Law enforcement had not yet fully arrived. There was no centralized control, only reaction. The first phase belonged entirely to those present, the people forced to respond in real time without guidance. As the sounds continued, the pattern intensified. Areas that had been crowded moments earlier cleared rapidly, leaving behind scattered belongings and empty spaces that felt unnatural. The absence of people in those areas made the situation feel even more serious. Further from the center, confusion lasted longer. Some individuals stopped, turning back, trying to understand what had caused the sudden shift. Others continued moving, unwilling to take the risk of stopping even briefly. Information spread in fragments. "He's over there." "No, it came from that side." "I don't know." The details did not align, but the urgency did, and that was enough to keep people moving. Within minutes, the entire area had transformed. What had begun as a normal day was now divided into two distinct realities: before, when everything felt predictable, and after, when nothing did. Sirens began to rise in the distance, faint at first, then gradually louder as they moved closer. For those inside the area, the sound brought a different kind of awareness, not immediate relief, but confirmation that the situation was being recognized beyond what they could see. Even with that, the uncertainty remained. The situation was still unfolding, still active, still unpredictable. And as the first wave of panic settled into a tense, controlled awareness, one reality became impossible to ignore. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not something that would pass quickly. This was a critical moment, one that would define everything that followed. As the first wave of panic pushed people away from the center of the outlets, movement began to spread outward into surrounding areas, but the tension did not fade. It changed. What had started as sudden, uncoordinated motion slowly turned into something more focused, though still driven by uncertainty. Groups formed naturally along the edges of the complex, near parking lanes, behind buildings, and in any space that offered even a slight sense of separation. People turned back, trying to understand what they had just left behind. No one had a complete answer. Some pointed toward one section of the outlets, others insisted it came from somewhere else, and a few believed there were multiple sources. The details conflicted, but the urgency remained consistent. That urgency kept people alert, even after they had created distance. Closer to the center, the environment was still unstable. Movement had cleared space, but the situation itself had not stopped. The absence of large crowds in certain areas made the scene feel more exposed, not safer. Open walkways that had been filled minutes earlier now revealed scattered belongings, dropped bags, and items left behind in the rush to leave. Inside stores, people remained hidden. Employees kept doors closed, lights low, and voices quiet. Some customers stayed in storage rooms or behind counters, waiting for any indication that it was safe to move. Time felt slower in those spaces, stretched by uncertainty and the lack of clear information. Outside, others continued to move until they reached a point that felt secure. Some stopped only when they were far enough away that the immediate tension lessened, while others kept going, unwilling to risk stopping at all. The instinct to create distance overpowered everything else. Communication began to increase, but clarity did not. Phones were in constant use. Calls were made, messages sent, locations shared, but most of the information was incomplete. People repeated what they had heard rather than what they knew, and that created overlapping narratives that did not fully align. Where are you? Are you safe? What happened? The answers rarely matched the questions. Near the central area, the first coordinated response began to take shape. Law enforcement units arrived and moved quickly toward the sections identified by multiple witnesses. Their approach was controlled but urgent, shifting immediately from observation to action. Officers began directing movement, guiding people further away and creating space for a structured response. The goal was to reduce chaos, establish boundaries, and gain control over an environment that had been unpredictable just moments earlier. The perimeter started to form. Not instantly, but in stages. Access points were secured, pathways were cleared, and areas were defined based on risk and accessibility. This structure began to replace the randomness that had dominated the first moments. Emergency responders followed closely, moving into position where they were needed most. Their actions were precise, focused on immediate priorities rather than the confusion surrounding them. The presence of coordinated teams introduced a different kind of energy into the scene, one that aimed to stabilize rather than react. For those watching from a distance, the change was visible. The environment was no longer defined by uncontrolled movement. It was being organized, section by section, into something manageable. But even with that structure, the uncertainty remained. People continued to gather at the edges, watching, waiting, and trying to understand what had happened. Conversations were quieter now, more focused, but still filled with unanswered questions. The initial shock had passed, but it had been replaced by something heavier. Awareness. Inside the response area, officers moved methodically, scanning the environment, communicating constantly, and narrowing their focus based on the information they received. Witnesses were approached, asked to describe what they had seen or heard, and those descriptions were used to build a clearer direction. The details were still incomplete, but patterns began to emerge. The disturbance had started within a specific section of the outlets, not across the entire area. The reaction had spread outward from that point, shaped by movement rather than direct awareness. Most people had not seen the beginning. They had responded to what others were doing. That explained the confusion. It also explained the speed. As more information was gathered, the response became more targeted. Units adjusted their positions, focusing on areas that matched the developing timeline. Communication improved, becoming more direct and less fragmented. Outside the perimeter, people remained in place. Some stood in silence, others spoke quietly, but no one treated the situation as over. The energy of the space had changed too completely for that. Names were called. Phones rang without answers. Messages were sent again. For many, the situation had become personal. Inside the structured response, the environment continued to stabilize, but the seriousness of what had happened became more apparent with each passing minute. This was no longer just a disruption. It was an event that required full attention, full coordination, and a complete understanding of how it had unfolded. Sirens continued to echo in the distance, blending into the scene rather than standing apart from it. They were no longer a signal of something approaching. They were part of what was already happening. The initial phase had ended. The response phase had begun. And with that shift, the focus moved from reacting to understanding. Not just what was happening in the moment, but what had already happened and what it meant moving forward. As the response became more organized, the focus shifted from immediate control to understanding exactly how the situation had unfolded. The initial chaos had been reduced, and in its place came a structured effort to build a clear timeline. Officers and investigators began working together, using witness accounts, observed movement and physical positioning to reconstruct the sequence step by step. Inside the central area, access was tightly controlled. Only authorized personnel moved through specific zones, each section marked by purpose. What had once been a crowded shopping space was now divided into areas of response, assessment, and observation. This separation allowed the situation to be examined without interference, creating the conditions needed for clarity. Witnesses were approached in a more focused way. Instead of general questions, they were asked to describe specific moments, where they were standing, what they heard first, and how they moved immediately after. These details, when compared across multiple accounts, began to align into a consistent structure. The beginning was now clearer. The disturbance originated within a defined section of the outlets, not across multiple locations at once. The first sounds triggered attention but not immediate understanding. People hesitated briefly, trying to interpret what they had heard, and that hesitation created a short but critical delay. Then movement began. Those closest reacted first, creating distance without waiting for confirmation. Others followed, not because they understood the situation, but because they saw movement and responded to it. This pattern explained why the reaction spread so quickly across the area. Behavior moved faster than information. Investigators used this understanding to map how the crowd shifted in those first seconds. Pathways of movement were traced, showing how people flowed away from the center and into surrounding spaces. These patterns were consistent across accounts and matched what responders observed when they arrived. Digital evidence added another layer of clarity. Videos and photos captured by witnesses helped confirm the timing and direction of movement. When aligned with statements, they reinforced the same sequence, reducing uncertainty and strengthening the timeline. Inside the analysis, attention also turned to the environment itself. The layout of the outlets, with open walkways and multiple access points, influenced how people reacted. While the space allowed movement, it also spread the reaction further, making it harder to contain in the early moments. This combination of openness and density created a situation where control could not be established immediately. The first phase was defined entirely by individual decisions, each one shaped by limited awareness and immediate instinct. As more details were confirmed, the structure of the event became increasingly stable. The early confusion that had defined the initial minutes was replaced by a clearer understanding of how each stage connected to the next. The sequence held. A sudden disturbance, a brief moment of hesitation, a rapid expansion of movement, and a transition into a coordinated response. Outside the central area, people continued to process what had happened. Some remained near the perimeter, watching as the response unfolded, while others moved further away but stayed connected through constant communication. The event had already extended beyond the physical space, carried by messages, calls, and shared information. Inside the command structure, communication improved as the timeline became clearer. Units adjusted their positions based on confirmed details, and the response shifted from broad coverage to more precise coordination. Each action was now guided by understanding rather than assumption. The atmosphere within the secured area reflected that shift. What had once been unpredictable was now controlled, though still serious. Every movement was deliberate, every decision measured against the information available. At the same time, the emotional weight of the situation began to settle in for those outside the immediate response. The urgency of movement had passed, but the reality of what had occurred was becoming clearer. The absence of noise in certain areas, the visible presence of responders, and the controlled nature of the scene all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not temporary. This was significant. Inside the investigation, the focus moved deeper into confirming each element of the timeline. Small details were examined carefully, not because they would change the overall sequence, but because they would strengthen it. The goal was precision, ensuring that every part of the event could be explained clearly and accurately. That precision mattered, because once the timeline was fully established, the next phase would begin. Not just understanding what happened, but understanding how it happened so quickly. And that question would define everything that followed. As the timeline became clearer, the investigation moved into a more focused phase centered on confirmation and precision. The sequence of events was no longer uncertain, but it still needed to be verified from multiple angles to ensure that every detail aligned. Investigators worked through each part of the timeline carefully, comparing witness accounts, physical positioning, and recorded footage to eliminate any remaining inconsistencies. Inside the secured area, movement was controlled and deliberate. Officers maintained clear boundaries while investigators documented the scene in detail. Every section of the outlets that had been part of the initial disturbance was examined, not only to confirm what had happened, but to understand how the environment influenced each stage of the event. Witness interviews became more specific. Instead of broad descriptions, individuals were asked to focus on exact moments, where they were positioned, what they heard first, how they moved, and what they saw others do. These details were layered together to reinforce the timeline and ensure that no critical element was missing. The consistency across accounts became more apparent. Most people described the same pattern: a sudden sound that broke the routine, a brief hesitation, and then immediate movement away from the source. Very few had direct visibility of the origin, but nearly all had reacted to the behavior of others. That confirmed a key point. The spread of the event was driven more by reaction than by direct awareness. Digital evidence continued to support this structure. Footage from different angles showed how quickly the crowd shifted, how movement spread across the space, and how the initial confusion transformed into a coordinated escape. When aligned with witness statements, these visuals strengthened the overall sequence. Inside the analysis, attention also turned to timing. The transition from normal activity to full panic had occurred within seconds, leaving almost no room for gradual escalation. This compressed timeline explained why so many decisions were made instinctively rather than deliberately. The environment played a critical role in this process. The open layout allowed people to move, but it also extended the reaction across a wider area. Instead of being contained, the situation expanded rapidly, making it more difficult to establish control in the early moments. As these factors were examined together, the event became easier to understand as a structured progression rather than a series of random actions. Outside the immediate scene, the situation continued to draw attention. Information spread through official channels and public communication, gradually replacing early confusion with more defined updates. While not every detail was confirmed immediately, the overall understanding of the event became clearer. Public awareness increased. Conversations shifted from uncertainty to analysis. People began to focus not only on what had happened, but on how it had unfolded and why it had escalated so quickly. Inside the response structure, coordination improved as more information became available. Units adjusted their roles based on confirmed details, ensuring that each part of the scene was managed effectively. The early phase of broad response had now transitioned into a more targeted and controlled operation. The atmosphere within the secured area reflected that change. What had once been chaotic was now organized, though still serious. Every action was guided by a clear objective, and every decision was supported by the information gathered. For those outside the perimeter, the emotional impact continued to develop. The urgency of the initial moments had passed, but the reality of the situation was becoming more defined. People who had been present began to process what they had experienced, connecting their individual perspectives to the larger sequence that was now being established. Inside the investigation, the final stages of reconstruction were nearing completion. The timeline held steady, supported by consistent evidence from multiple sources. There were no major gaps, no contradictions strong enough to alter the sequence. The event was no longer uncertain. It was understood. But with that understanding came a new focus. Not just what happened, but how it could happen so quickly in a place that felt controlled and routine. And that question would shape the final phase of the investigation. As the investigation moved into its final phase, the focus shifted from reconstruction to full verification and interpretation. The timeline was no longer changing, and each element of the event had been confirmed through multiple sources. What remained was to ensure that every detail fit together without contradiction and to understand the broader context that shaped the moment. Investigators reviewed the sequence again from beginning to end, not to find new information, but to confirm accuracy. Witness accounts, digital footage, and physical positioning all aligned with the same structure. The event had followed a clear progression, and that progression could now be explained with confidence. The analysis highlighted several key factors that influenced how quickly the situation escalated. First was the environment. The open layout of the outlets allowed people to move freely, but it also meant that once the reaction began, it spread rapidly across a wide area. There were multiple paths, multiple directions, and no single point of control in the early moments. Second was timing. The transition from normal activity to full panic occurred within seconds. There was no gradual buildup, no extended period of warning. The sudden nature of the event forced people to rely on instinct rather than deliberate decision-making. Third was awareness. Most individuals did not see the origin of the disturbance directly. They reacted to movement, to the behavior of others, rather than to clear information. This pattern amplified the speed of the response and contributed to the confusion in the first moments. Together, these factors created a situation where control could not be established immediately. The first phase was defined entirely by individual reactions, each one shaped by limited understanding and immediate urgency. Outside the investigation, public attention continued to grow. The event was no longer confined to the physical space where it occurred. It had become part of a wider conversation, with discussions focusing on both the sequence of events and the conditions that influenced them. Different perspectives began to emerge. Some emphasized the unpredictability of the situation, pointing to how quickly it developed and how little time people had to respond. Others focused on the response itself, examining decisions made in those critical seconds and questioning how different actions might have changed the outcome. These perspectives did not conflict with the established timeline, but they added layers to how the event was understood. Inside the structured process, however, the objective remained unchanged. The goal was to maintain clarity and accuracy, ensuring that every detail presented was supported by evidence. Interpretation was secondary to verification. As more details were confirmed, the case reached a point where no major uncertainties remained. The sequence was complete, the factors were identified, and the connections between them were clear. The event was no longer being analyzed in fragments. It was understood as a whole. For those who had been present, the experience remained personal and immediate. The shift from routine to crisis had been sudden, and that transition left a lasting impression. The memory of those moments, the confusion, the movement, and the urgency did not fade quickly. For those outside the event, understanding came through information, through reports and analysis that explained what had happened and why it had unfolded the way it did. Each retelling reinforced the significance of the moment, ensuring that it remained part of a larger awareness. Inside the investigation, the final documentation phase began. Every element of the case was recorded in detail, creating a complete account that could be reviewed, referenced, and understood without ambiguity. The purpose was not only to conclude the investigation, but to preserve the sequence accurately. The timeline held firm. The structure remained consistent. And the event stood as a clear example of how quickly a controlled environment can change when multiple factors align within a narrow window of time. With that, the investigation moved toward its conclusion, leaving behind a complete and verified understanding of what had occurred. As the case reached its conclusion, the final phase focused on presenting a complete and verified account of what had happened. The sequence was no longer uncertain or open to change. It had been confirmed through consistent evidence, aligned across witness accounts, digital records, and the structured analysis that followed the event from beginning to end. What started as an ordinary day had unfolded in a clear progression. A sudden disturbance that broke the routine. A rapid shift in awareness. a wave of movement driven by instinct, and a response that formed under pressure. Inside the final review, investigators examined each stage once more to ensure that every detail fit within the established timeline. Nothing stood alone. Every element connected to another, forming a structure that could be understood without relying on assumption. There were no major gaps. No contradictions strong enough to alter the sequence. The event was no longer a question. It was a defined reality. At the same time, attention turned to the factors that shaped how it unfolded so quickly. The environment played a central role. The open design of the outlets allowed movement in multiple directions, but it also meant that once the reaction began, it spread across a wider area without control in the early moments. Timing reinforced that effect. The transition from normal activity to full disruption occurred within seconds, leaving little room for measured decisions. Most people responded based on immediate perception, not complete understanding. Awareness varied across individuals. Some recognized the shift earlier, reacting instantly, while others followed the movement of the crowd without knowing the source. This difference created a chain reaction, where behavior spread faster than information. Together, these elements explain not only what happened but how it expanded so rapidly. Outside the investigation, the impact of the event continued to carry weight. It had moved beyond the physical location and become part of a broader awareness. Discussions, reports, and repeated analysis ensured that the moment would not be forgotten quickly. For those who had been present, the experience remained personal. The memory of the sudden shift, the urgency, and the uncertainty stayed with them, shaped by how quickly everything had changed. The transition from routine to crisis had been immediate, and that contrast defined the experience. For others, the understanding came through information. Each retelling added clarity, but also reinforced the significance of the event as something that extended beyond a single place or moment. Inside the final documentation, the structure remained clear. The sequence was established. The details were confirmed. And the event was understood in full, not as a random occurrence, but as a progression shaped by environment, timing, and human reaction. The day did not begin with significance. It became significant because of how quickly everything changed. And in the end, what remained was not only the memory of what happened, but the understanding of how it happened and why it unfolded the way it did. A reminder that even in spaces that feel controlled and predictable, change can come without warning, and when it does, the outcome is shaped by a sequence of moments that build faster than anyone expects. Once that sequence begins, it cannot be reversed. It can only be understood.